Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me? This is on, and you can hear me. That's fantastic. Well, colleagues, friends, I'd like to begin by saying a big thank you to Priya and the organizers of this series for giving me the privilege and the opportunity to come and share with you my take as a public health physician on climate change, its impacts on human health, and our public health take on why we really need closer interdisciplinary and intersectoral collaboration if we want to get anywhere with this whole challenge we face. What I'm going to do is give you some, facts. What do we know about climate change, and especially highlight some key aspects of the most recent report from the IPCC that's just been published in October, and then share with you the major impacts on human health, and then hopefully get to so what could we do about it, and then leave enough time for you perhaps to share with me what you think we could do together to address climate change. So our health has improved dramatically across the world in about 100 years. So here are some lovely maps produced by Max Rosa of Oxford University. And if you look at the top map, it shows you life expectancy in the 1800s, where everybody and everywhere life expectancy was equally poor. So at that time, it would have been somewhere between the 20s and the 40s. And then we started to develop these very unequal living standards, which emerged between the developed and the developing countries, as reflected by life expectancy of about 60 in the developed countries by about 1950, and remained at about 40, so still the deep reds in the developing world. So India, for example, at the time of her independence from British rule in 1947, had a life expectancy of 35. But then, thankfully, the developing world is catching up extremely rapidly. So by 2012, India's life expectancy was 68 and UK was 81. Meanwhile, of course, the population has trebled, although fewer live in absolute poverty because of the dramatic economic progress the world has seen during the 20th century. Does that mean we're going to carry on going up that trajectory of life expectancy? And that's where the uncertainty is, because society now finds itself at a turning point. Ban Ki-moon, the previous Secretary General of the UN, took every opportunity to remind us that climate change is the defining challenge of our age. The commitment of some climate scientists and public health champions over about 2 decades was not matched by that of policymakers during this time. And evidence shows that climate change is already having a profound and detrimental impact on public health. The greatest iniquity about public health is this fact that the most severely affected in terms of health impacts are the developing countries. And you can see them as the bloated countries in this cartogram, the lower map. And these are produced by University College London and published in the Lancet some years ago. Whereas the biggest emitters, of course, of greenhouse gases are the developed countries, which are shown as the sort of bloated countries in the top map. And this is carrying on, despite the fact that even by 2003, WHO was pointing out to us that climate-sensitive diseases were already having a huge burden of mortality, particularly in the developing world, in parts such as Asia and Africa. And now, on top of all of that, we have the IPCC special report published only last month and entitled Global Warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade, which has the starkest message yet, which is that the current Paris commitments to reduce emissions are inadequate and could lead to more than 3 degrees centigrade of global warming by 2100, and that there's a need for rapidly strengthening the global response to the threat of climate change and the threat to sustainable development and to efforts to eradicate poverty. It further goes on to acknowledge that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C will be very challenging, and that at the current rate of increase, global warming is actually likely to achieve 1.5 degrees centigrade as early as between 2030 and 2052, because warming is occurring earlier and more rapidly than expected. They also point out that 1.5 degrees centigrade is not some kind of political concession that out of the kindness of their hearts the scientists have offered to the policymakers, and that 2 degrees centigrade would actually be dangerous. And what that means for lay people like me, and I call myself lay in this context because I'm not a climate scientist, is that global net human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide must be reduced from 2010 levels by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero around 2050. That's an extraordinary challenge that we all have to work towards. Why am I showing you all this? Not because I want to bore you all and go on with these facts, but I'm keen to highlight these points because of the extent to which the tone in terms of bluntness and the language of the report has changed, with a line being drawn in the sand, something that scientists rarely do, and words such as, we must act now in these reports. And further, there's a very loud and clear call to strengthen the capacities for climate action, not just of national and subnational authorities, but civil society, the private sector, indigenous people, local communities to support climate action, and encouraging international cooperation as a critical enabler for developing countries and vulnerable regions to play their full part in this process. And on top of all of that, there was this report, which was less well publicized than the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report. And that was the recent news about the threat to civilization posed by the speed and extent of wildlife destruction, as reported by the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. What we're informed is that since 1970, humanity has wiped out a staggering 60% of vertebrate animals. What comes as a surprise, because we all believe the UK to be a green and pleasant land, don't we? That the UK has lost significantly more nature over the long term than the global average, with 56% of species, terrestrial and freshwater, having declined since about 1970. So that on a measure known as the Biodiversity Intactness Index, the UK was the 29th lowest out of 218 countries. I have to say, I read that several times because I just couldn't believe it when I read that for the first time. And climate change, urbanization, modern land management, and agricultural policy, these sorts of things are cited as the main factors behind these rather grim statistics. And the threat to biodiversity is so serious that Pascal Palmer, the chief of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, offers the stark choice that either in 2 years we agree a new deal for nature or document our own extinction and write as possibly the final thing our own epitaph. So moving on to the health impacts of climate change, until around the 1990s, there was little interest among epidemiologists in studying the risks posed to health from variations in climate. But that began to change about 25 years ago when interest grew in understanding how climate variations were affecting human health and survival. And that's when public health epidemiologists began to recognize that climate change is not a unidimensional risk. In fact, the spectrum of risk to health is so wide that it's almost without limits. It's unbounded in some respects. People living in diverse socioeconomic and physical conditions are affected very differently, but always with the poor being most vulnerable within and between populations. And the mental health toll is actually incalculable of all of this. It's also the case that women are disproportionately vulnerable to the effects of climate change relative to men, because they take the brunt of climate change as they make up the majority of the world's poor, and they have the fewest resources to overcome the negative effects. I think, Kavita Ramdas, who was the president of the Global Fund for Women, put it very well when she said the gender inequalities that define women's lives prior to a climate disaster are really what put them at such greatly increased risk from climate change. So moving swiftly on, what exactly are the major health impacts? And what is the Lancet Countdown, an independent assessment which is tracking progress on health and climate change? And the countdown is made up of about 25 academic institutions, including the Grantham Institute and Imperial College. So what is it telling us about trends in these health effects? So global warming is exacerbating existing health problems and introducing new threats, including cardiovascular and chronic kidney disease. We have known about the risk to cardiovascular systems for a while, but the chronic kidney disease risk is something which we are beginning to understand more recently. Emerging evidence is suggesting a link between chronic kidney disease, dehydration, and climate change. Can we be surprised at that when we see this picture of this woman stonecutter possibly toiling away at 40 degrees plus centigrade out there with not a toilet or a drinking water source in sight? Can we be surprised at these statistics and what that signifies and what it reminds us about the daily lives of millions of people around the world? And just in case we believe that heat exposure is confined to the tropical regions, look at how warm spell durations have significantly increased in the UK since the 1960s. So obviously I don't expect you to read this, but just look at how the deep reds have changed in these Met Office maps showing the durations of warm spells in the UK. So the Lancet Countdown estimates that vulnerable people exposed to heat wave events increased by about 125 million during that period, 2016, with the impacts being direct heat stress, stroke exacerbations of pre-existing heart failure, and increased incidence of acute kidney disease. Meanwhile, global labor capacity in rural areas exposed to temperature change has reduced by about 5.3% since 2000. But that still leaves millions of people working in the merciless heat and sun in the outdoors. Health impacts of weather-related disasters. What we know is 90% of disasters worldwide have been weather-related in the past 20 years, and that the frequency of weather-related disasters has also increased by 46% during that time. Asia is the most affected continent with a huge human toll, as the statistics highlight. In 2007, England witnessed the wettest summer since records began. When there was extreme rainfall concentrated in a relatively short period of time, with the west of the country most affected. And who can forget these images of Tewkesbury Abbey, looking as if it's located in the middle of a lake or a sea. And the hard facts are even more compelling. 55,000 properties were flooded, 7,000 people needed to be rescued by emergency services, 13 people died, probably the first climate deaths in Britain. The country faced the largest loss of essential services since World War II, with about 500,000 people left without mains water and electricity for days on end. Transport networks failed, a dam breach was narrowly averted, And actually, emergency services were put totally out of action. And the total cost of the damage was estimated at about £3 billion by insurers. And that was the most expensive of the weather-related disasters in 2007. Weather-related disasters, too, have a disproportionately higher impact on women than men, with women 14 times more likely to die than men during a disaster. For example, during the 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh, which killed about 140,000 people, 90% of the victims were women. And again, in that wealthiest of countries, when Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005, most of the victims trapped in central New Orleans were African-American women and their children, the poorest segment of the population in that part of the country. Indeed, an analysis of disasters in 141 countries by the London School of Economics researchers showed that where women's rights were compromised, female mortality was higher than for males. And women's roles as primary caregivers, staying in the house to look after their dependents, the young children and the elderly, even if there's commotion and chaos outside, and cultural norms such as that girls may not be taught how to swim, even if their brothers are taught how to swim, are cited as possible reasons for this disproportionately high toll among women. There are also major shifts in patterns and distributions of vector-borne diseases observed worldwide as a result of climate change. So, for example, as vectorial capacity of specific vectors, what we mean by vectorial capacity is the ability of vectors to infect as yet uninfected populations. So as vectorial capacity of specific vectors has increased, at least in part due to climate change, annual numbers of dengue have doubled every decade since 1990, with 58.4 million cases in 2013 and 10,000 deaths during that period. And it is also likely that emerging or re-emerging arboviruses such as chikungunya and Zika are similarly responsive to climate change. Globally, people at risk of malaria have also increased by about 3 to 5%. But the good news there is that fewer people die, so the deaths from malaria has declined, even if the prevalence has increased. And that's to do with access to, better access to treatments in most countries. Once again, women are more vulnerable because of the risks in pregnancy, and malaria remains a big cause of maternal mortality in sub-Saharan Africa. Drought-related food and water shortages may lead to severe undernutrition, population displacements, and even climate conflict. Of course, it isn't only drought, but also rise in temperatures and precipitation, which may affect crop yields. The Lancet Countdown estimates that the number of undernourished people increased by about 24 million, from 398 million to 422 million in the 30 most vulnerable countries worldwide. And if we move away from the 30 most vulnerable countries and think of a place where lots of rich people live, imagine living in Cape Town at this particular point in time. It's been in the grips of the worst drought in a century, where the municipal authorities essentially ordered people to restrict their water use or risk having their water supply cut off. And they've been rationed down to 50 liters of water per day, and which has only just been increased to 70 liters because they've had a moderate level of rainfall in September. I looked up their website because I wanted to, I didn't have an easy understanding of what 50 liters mean, and that's a 5-minute shower. And imagine having to have just that for your entire day's use of water. And it's really hard to imagine for us in almost one of the most profligate water-using countries, because our use is about 150 to 175 liters a day in this country. So, is this our new normal? Could 2018 be remembered as the year when the first of the world's great cities ran out of water, and we start to reboot the whole system to be able to know how to manage this as other cities are lining up for that same dubious distinction that Cape Town has faced this year. Here too, women are at a greater disadvantage. They are responsible for 50 to 80% of world food production, yet they will eat less during a famine. As was pointed out by this study conducted by social scientists working with Oxfam, when they observed the behaviors during the Great Famine in Rajasthan, India, in about between 2003 and 2005. What this shows is reductions in eating and in nutrition. So elderly women ate less than elderly men, adult women ate less than adult men, and girl children girl children experienced a greater reduction of food and nutrition than boy children. Also, being responsible for managing household water, women are walking longer distances, as Water Aid will tell us, to fetch safe water, leaving less time to contribute to paid work, and halving household income. The weather is an important determinant of health, and weather patterns resulting from climate change are associated with chest infections, asthma, allergic rhinitis, and premature mortality. Climate change-induced forest fires and the resulting smoke and air pollution greatly increase the risk of acute and chronic cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease. Climate change has also prolonged the pollen season and increased the concentration of some pollens, especially the most highly allergenic ones. And with air pollution and pollens acting in synergy, the risk of allergic rhinitis is vastly increased. And if you ask any GP, they'll tell you that they can see how the burden of allergic rhinitis and asthma and so on have increased in the past decade or so. Climate change-induced migration is being triggered due to sea level rise, crop failures, reduced food and water security, and conflicts, such as in Darfur in Sudan, which at least in part has been explained by pastoral communities at war with each other because of competition for the same diminishing natural resources. The Lancet Countdown identifies only 4,400 people as true climate migrants in its assessment. These are people from small communities in Alaska and some small island states who have had to move, who've had to migrate directly due to climate change. There can be no controversy about that. But they do acknowledge that the scale of migration from climate change is far greater already, and it's going to be possibly biblical in the future. I mean, take a look at this, the newspaper report I read a few years ago, where Kiribati, the whole government of Kiribati, an island in the Pacific, is planning en masse to turn off the lights in their country and move to Fiji when eventually they get submerged. Climate conflict, again, amplifies existing gender inequalities as it exposes women and children to higher levels of violence in the home and in post-disaster refugee camps, as was confirmed following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when these reports of sexual assaults increased in the post-refugee camps that were set up for them. And one can only wonder about the future as countries as big as India and China start to compete for common freshwater resources, for example. So, why do I believe that health activism is our big, big hope moving on from that? We need to acknowledge that we are in an existential crisis. Many of you are climate scientists, and you advise us that we have 12 years left to act, and that action on a scale that we've never imagined before must begin now. Whole of society engagement is called for. And having thought about this and having been a convener of something called the Climate and Health Council, a sort of campaigning organization that some of us set up about a decade ago, but which is no longer in existence because it's been overtaken by other campaigning groups. was that the first thing we need to do is to instill hope and optimism in people if we are to engage them in common actions. And I think that's something I have learned from the brilliant work of Waterade, where they take a serious message like why we must invest in more safe water and sanitation and hygiene by giving you an impression of what a better world might be and what your part might be in creating that better world. So I put up two pictures that they took with Joey Lawrence, a well-known photographer, in their projects in Sierra Leone. And these pictures have won prestigious photography awards like the Taylor Wessing Awards, which are equivalent to the Turner Prize in art, I think because of the powerful images of optimism and hope and the fact that we could get to a better world that they create. And of course, who could disagree with our national treasure, Sir David Attenborough, who advises against alarmism and whose own gentle way of knowledge sharing has had such a profound global influence on our views about plastic, indeed our revulsion for plastic now. So there's a growing consensus since the Climate and Health Council started debating this, that the best chance of generating hope, optimism, and engagement is perhaps going for focusing on the health co-benefits of climate change mitigation. And so the what's good for the planet is good for health slogan might just work. Because there's a whole range of diseases whose prevalence is increasing because of climate change, but where you can make a very powerful case that mitigating climate change would reduce the burden of these diseases as near-time demonstrable co-benefits. And the Lancet Countdown has actually started measuring progress with achievement of some of these health co-benefits as indicators of how the world is progressing on this journey towards decarbonization. A study led by the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago on air pollution and health showed that reductions in life expectancy of about 4.3 years due to air pollution could be expected in cities in India and China, and around 4 months of reduction even here in London. Yet, of course, our energy demand and CO2 emissions continue to rise. And indeed, there are, despite all of that, billions do not have access to electricity and may be relying on unsafe and unsustainable solid fuels even at this point in time. PM 2.5 concentrations are well above WHO guidelines in all of the cities that are being monitored, 245 cities being monitored by the Lancet Countdown. And while sustainable travel infrastructure of the kind that we need to mitigate climate change is still a distant target, and privatized motor transport continues to grow in emerging cities, the good news is that renewable electricity as a share of total generation has increased worldwide, so that's good news. Non-conventional transport fuels are gaining traction, even if we are principally still dependent on petrol and diesel. And the other bit of good news is that ruminant meat available for consumption has decreased slightly, and that's encouraging from the point of view of bowel cancer and heart disease. And the health sector, which is a big emitter of greenhouse gases, is just beginning to measure its emissions in many parts of the world. To these, I would add the billions without access to safe water and sanitation. Schools and hospitals aren't exempt, If you go to some of these countries, you can see that hand washing is lacking even in big, swanky-looking hospitals in the developing world. And you can imagine, what the results are of that in terms of the burden of diarrheal disease in children, stunting of children, which sets them up for lower life expectancy and poorer health, and the scary issue of global antimicrobial resistance because of antibiotics being used almost as a proxy for water, where there isn't running water. And we ignore this crisis at our peril. So, quoting the Lancet, the overall impression of this is that the direction of travel is positive and it is set, but much more needs to be done because of the mismatch between political inertia and the scale of the problem, and that we need to act together to mobilize behavior change on a monumental scale. So what might we do together? Here's some suggestions, and I'd love to hear yours. We need to inform ourselves. Many of you are the experts in relation to the earth and climate sciences and biodiversity, and we in public health specialize in estimating the human impacts and also communicating with and motivating the public. The gap relates to the best evidence as to what is happening now and how to act, and it brings to mind an NHS success story. The NHS in 2000 launched the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence to do away with what the Prime Minister at that time called the postcode lottery of care, which occurred because of the uncertainty as to the benefits of individual treatments and disease management pathways, so that care was variable across the country. It may surprise you, but until that time, your cancer survival might have been different in one part of the country where they might have kept abreast with cutting-edge treatments compared with another where they might not have done. So NICE changed all of that. And not only does NICE ensure through its guidelines and recommendations that everyone, including healthcare professionals and the public, have access to the best clinical advice in this country, but it's a hugely valuable resource globally. The Lancet Countdown, in listing actions needed, included the need to minimize reliance on unproven technologies. Now, if we need that, we need a NICE-like organization to bring all of this evidence together on climate change. So, for example, could WaterAid have access to information on the most efficient and effective models of water and sanitation in a variety of developing country settings? What should the best model be for Cape Town, do you suppose, in the future? What combination of actions would help me minimize my carbon footprint? So collaboration on a NICE equivalent, I feel, would be of huge benefit. Secondly, we need to affirm, we need to give leadership through personal actions. We mustn't underestimate how powerful role models are. So, for example, what are the carbon footprints of our own departments? It never fails to amuse my developing country counterparts when public health academics from the developed countries go whizzing around the world telling everybody how terribly bad things are, when actually natural resource constraints mean that they have to make better use of their IT and communications facilities. Why don't we do the same thing? And third, we need to advocate for change, even if the messages are unpopular. And again, I was reminded of something almost 30 years ago when I began to be interested in climate change, when I discovered that the NHS paid the hospital consultant who drove the big, powerful car a higher mileage reimbursement rate for taking his car from his hospital base to a distant health center to undertake, let's say, an outpatient clinic, and paid less mileage reimbursement to the junior doctor who might have driven a smaller car, 1-liter engine car. And when I suggested that that should be changed and flipped over, it wasn't met with great positivity at that time. But I like to think that things have changed, and that sort of thing wouldn't happen now because we are all very much more aware of the problems of climate change and what the risk factors are. And fourth, we need to engage society if we want to accelerate action. Jane Burston of the Clean Air Fund points out that people know about climate change, so that's not the issue. We don't need to tell them, and they are concerned. The challenge is action. Concerns exist, but they don't inform or influence our day-to-day decisions. Rarely is it critical in an election, for example. Rarely do we consider climate change in deciding how to travel, how to invest our money, or which energy supplier to use. And we need to engage people in meaningful agency, and that means translating complex scientific data into simple messages, focusing on what is happening to them. You couldn't have lived 2 decades in this country without noticing that the climate is changing. So point out things that they can relate to and give them this hope that small changes they can make will offer potential near-term healthcare benefits, and that might create the urgency and get them to act with us. We're also, of course, in this era of diminishing empathy. And indeed, the British Social Attitude Survey revealed that only 19% of over 65s, with 31% of 18 to 34-year-olds were very concerned about climate change. And the astonishingly rapid rise in veganism, for example, and food consumption patterns amongst the young is probably testimony to this. And social marketing and the science of communication are needed. And those are the skills within the community, the public health community, to segment populations and have targeted approaches which would appeal to each of the segments that need this particular focus to, if you like, motivate them to change. And we need much more collaborative research on what works to translate science into action. Lastly, we need to rapidly increase the recognition of the importance of women's participation and leadership in every aspect of climate action. Women have knowledge and skills to adapt to climate change and reduce poverty. They're more likely to volunteer for disaster management, to build and maintain social networks, to build community resilience. But what they need is the power and the influence, the tools and the resources, and that's what they don't have. And I want to share with you 3 lovely examples. During a drought in the federal states of Micronesia, again Pacific Islands, it was women's knowledge of the island's hydrology, which meant that eventually they were able to identify where and locate where the water was and have access to potable water. There's a study of 61 nations which showed that countries with large and numerous women's non-governmental organizations had a lower rate of deforestation. And in La Masica in the Honduras, once women were recruited to help with early warning systems. And when the next disaster, Hurricane Mitch, struck, there were no fatalities. And there's something that's fallen out of the public discourse, and that is to do with population growth. And I think that's something we need to bring back, a better understanding of population dynamics, gender and reproductive health. And there's a study which shows that investment in family planning and girls' education reduces greenhouse gas emissions as much as investing the same amount of funds in wind and nuclear, new wind and nuclear energy. Of course, none of this is achievable unless we have gender equity in research and advocacy. The International Panel for Climate Change has become the authoritative scientific voice on climate change since the first report was published in 1990. But authorship leans towards natural sciences, the more developed countries, non-indigenous voices, and men. And although women in the IPCC are among the world's most respected and recognized climate scientists, it's very surprising recently to read a report that they perceive gender, race, nationality, family responsibilities, language to be important barriers for their and other women's full participation in climate science and assessments. Diana Liverman from the Department of Geography, University of Arizona, who is an IPCC author and a very senior person in IPCC, in the IPCC network, co-authored a study with Miriam Gay-Antakya. And the study was conducted of IPCC women authors. And what they showed was that the authors were, a majority of them were white European scientists. Despite that, many felt little impact in influencing the overall report. And there were multiple levels of discrimination faced by women of color, small stature, and from a developing country. And when I read that, I thought, ooh, I'm quite pleased that I'm not an IPCC author. So despite the fact that many of the respondents actually felt that they were well supported and did contribute to their full potential, the overall finding was that gender, they perceived gender to be a barrier to their success. They felt that female climate researchers are not well represented in the climate community. And what I feel, and what makes me uneasy about that, is that it challenges the representativeness, the legitimacy, and the content of the reports. And it gives ammunition to the climate deniers, and we mustn't allow that to happen. Thankfully, though, things are improving because women authors have increased from 2% in 1990 to 38% in the 2018 special report published in October. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I think we still have a chance of transforming climate change from being the biggest threat to public health to tackling it so that it could be the greatest opportunity to improve global health, but also to achieve equity and sustainability in every aspect of our lives if we really gave it our best shot. And rapid strengthening of collaboration across our disciplines in research, policy development, and public advocacy is really our only route in the future. Thank you very much.
Oh, right, okay. So you kind of mentioned the responsibility that's on individuals. There is a lot of responsibility put on us to sort of recycle and reduce our emissions and things like that. But I don't feel like enough responsibility is given to, say, industry and manufacturers. So, I mean, if you go to the supermarket, it's impossible for you to avoid plastic because everything is excuse me, everything is packaged in plastic. So what do you think can be done to sort of pressurize that part of society?
It is tough, isn't it? And I think that goes for all of us. And in fact, my question back to you would almost be, so what do we do? Because I worry about that too. I've now started to make increasing use of social media. And for example, I tweeted that I'm simply no longer, on principle, prepared to buy packaged vegetables. Hear it from me, waitress, I'm not going to do that anymore. It's very tough because initially, perhaps you'd have to almost deny yourself certain vegetables because they only ever come in cellophane wrapping. But, I think those are the sort of almost the gentlest ways by which we could start, if you like, being pretty firm about our stance and what we consider to be appropriate and what we consider not to be. And I don't think industry can say, well, we're going to stop packaging by 2040 or something. And here we are, we're being told, we could prepare for the worst almost by 2030 or 2040 already. So a bit of tinkering at the edges and stopping plastic wrapping by then is not going to work. So we do have a problem. There are some other things we could do. We could start inquiring where our investments go, because plastic is a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry. I mean, engineers in this room, can you confirm? I believe that is the case. So did you read in the papers, for instance, that recently the National Trust was found to have investments in fossil fuel industries? Now, in any organization we are connected with, we could start asking the question, are you invested in companies which are producing plastics? And the fossil fuel industry is the main one here. So we could start to ask those questions, which begin to make organizations uncomfortable and aware that enough's enough, and that's how we feel. The other thing is about doing it together. So creating a community of people, because it's actually quite scary. None of us wants to stand up. Many of us don't wish to get arrested. And yet, out there is a group you might have heard of called Extinction Rebellion, which has got off the ground of people who really are prepared to take some very drastic action. And I wouldn't for one moment advocate that for myself or any of you, but how do we say enough is enough and we want change? And there are some lessons from the apartheid era, for example, when students played a very, very big role in getting the big banks, people like that, who continue to operate in South Africa, to withdraw and to begin to be worried about seeming to support apartheid. So I think creating a community and thinking what are those fairly gentle actions, but which demonstrate a firmness of purpose. What could those be? And if we start one or two of those actions, perhaps we might be motivated to go down that route and take up some more. But there are, in the way that veganism is growing, people have clearly decided for themselves they will not eat ruminant meat anymore, meat at all anymore. Some are becoming vegetarian, some vegan, and so on. There are people who are considering in what ways they could change their behavior in order to take a stand on principle and to start reducing their own carbon footprint. So there are those sorts of things that one could do.
Do you not think there's a role for legislation in that? So, I mean, they've introduced this 5 tax for us to use pesticides. Why can't that be done on the other side of it as well? So, when you go to try and avoid packaged vegetables, then if you want the root vegetables, you've got to put them in a plastic bag, like things like that. Again, I think that there has to be a role for government and legislation to force some of these companies.
Of course there is. Absolutely. That goes without saying. But I mean, the problem here is that is the inertia at our policy making level, isn't it? And I just wanted to point out that we co-edited, I instigated and got some friends together because I just didn't have the time to edit it by myself. But it was a book we wrote for our own health practitioners because people would say, what are greenhouse gases and what would you mean by climate change in around 2007? I thought we need to write these facts down and provide a simple guide. And the bigger half was how to act. And when I reread it in preparing for today, I thought, well, some of the facts have changed in that, there's an even greater urgency to act. So some of the climate facts have changed. But the to-do list, there's nothing that's changed at all because that's the extent to which there's been policy and legal inertia. And so that's why, the scientists are beginning to be slightly more emotional in their reports, where they're calling for a strengthening of the global response and bringing in indigenous voices and communities and so on. If you go back to 1990, that's not what the report said. So how do we bring this to the attention of our political leaders and say enough is enough? So it's those sorts of things, speaking to an MP before an election and saying, what is your stand on plastic? What are you prepared to do? And we'd like you to bring in legislation now, not in 20 years' time. The Prime Minister has made a pledge, hasn't she, that she's going to do something about plastic. But again, the urgency is something that is not felt as yet. And that's something that maybe we could compel through beginning to ask questions. If we did it as a group, then it becomes, you're more protected, and you're part of a community that's doing this together.
If I can first just quickly comment on this discussion and then go on to my question. I read somewhere, I thought, a very good analogy about people's behavior and climate change, and it was about fire alarms and how people usually don't really react to a fire alarm if they hear one. But if they see everyone running out the door, they're like, oh shit, I should run out the door myself. And that's why I think even if I think most people would be so happy if politicians would limit companies' possibilities to produce plastic waste or whatever, I think politicians won't also see the urgency until they see enough people reacting. And that can be by protesting on the street, but that can also be by these micro protests in your daily life of avoiding plastic. So I don't think it's about putting the responsibility on the individual, but I think it's about these micro protests that will create the sense of urgency. Then on to my actual question. I was thinking, I think a lot of health charities at the moment don't really mention climate change in their campaigns and advertising. Do you think there's any chance of sort of getting them on board? I'm often thinking, for example, cancer, like a huge cause is air pollution, but rarely do I see cancer charities campaigning against air pollution.
Oh, that's interesting. Obviously, the charities such as Oxfam, Save the Children, Waterrelated, the big global charities that are, if you like, almost on a daily basis in their project countries facing climate change while they're continuing with their work, are very minded as to how their work is influenced by climate change. And some of these very elegant, qualitative studies of what's going on, very powerful case studies, are actually published by Oxfam and its research department, which is actually pretty big. And they do a lot of lobbying. For example, they've been, they've been getting into the big annual general meetings held by companies, where the company that's a big polluter might be holding a meeting, and they're going to those meetings and then challenging them by asking questions at those meetings. So there's a fair amount of that kind of activism going on among those charities. But you're quite right that our diabetes charity, where, why isn't it being said that if you do something about your obesity, you're actually helping climate change too, because you are cutting you're using sustainable travel, possibly you are walking more than you're using motorized transport, you are consuming food that's got a smaller carbon footprint. So do it this way. That's an association they're not making, but I'm very happy to take that back to some of them and say, why don't you do it? Because that might actually create that sense of urgency I was talking about, which doesn't exist at this point in time. Good point. And I liked your previous point too. I absolutely agree with that.
So yeah, we've touched on plastic and water and air pollution, but actually a lot of CO2 emissions are produced from the meat industry, which is funny because you don't see adverts advertising plastic or diesel, but however people tend to advertise a lot on meat, which seems a bit like a flaw because meat is arguably maybe something that can be quite easily changed in people's diets. So I was wondering what you think about the meat industry and climate change.
Well, that interestingly is at one level almost the easiest bit of protest, if you like, that has been possible, because it's not as public. My going to a supermarket and saying, well, take all this packaging away is quite a public demonstration of, there I am throwing a bit of a tantrum, and that's not very pleasant, and that's not the way we behave. And yet, just changing your diet is something you do in private. You do that as an individual, and people are doing it. 1 in 8 now are vegetarians or vegans, as I understand it. And I think the meat industry must be getting quite worried about this, because it's taken off and it's highly successful. It's no longer the kind of fad it used to be maybe 2 decades ago. These are sustained lifestyle changes people are making because of their concern for climate and the desire for better health and controlling weight and so on. So that's the one that people are going for, because it's the easiest to do. Not very easy if you like your meat. So but easier to do than doing something about plastic, because plastic is just so ubiquitous. You know, look around this room. Virtually everything here is made of plastic. So that is a harder one to crack.
So thank you for your speech. I don't want to blame any sector. I'll say this because my question may be blaming someone. So I believe that climate change is now affecting healthcare, but before, like, I guess our lifestyles and the desire to have like this consumption and everything, and our desire to have a longer life expectancy and live better and everything affected climate change in the first place, because we produce it, machines, innovation, and everything that affected climate change, the weather, and then climate change contributed. So to what extent do you think we should give up our desire to a better lifestyle and, I don't know, 100 years of lives for, like, to help our planet and to mitigate the impact of climate change?
Yeah, and you know, the interesting point there is, what do we mean by a better lifestyle? Because, you know, the way we define a better lifestyle, or the way we imagine it, is more, you know, consumable goods. That's generally how we define it. And actually there are plenty of studies that show that more and more goods actually do not make us happy. And there is also research in parallel that's demonstrated that well-being, just a sense of well-being, increases longevity by 4 to 10 years. It increases our life expectancy by 4 to 10 years if you have a real sense of well-being. And well-being is not directly correlated with if I have more of this and more of that. And I think that's the key message to get across to people. Because more things, more food is actually making us sick. It's giving us diabetes. It's reducing our life expectancy. You know, actually lowering that, but enjoying what we have is creating a better sense of well-being and improving our physical health. Is those sorts of messages that we need to if you like, disseminate, because what we need to do is to uncouple that image that the, you know, that the, if you like, the economic strategies of the past have led us to, which is more, as if that translates into better health, better well-being, and there is research that shows it does not do that. Makes us quite unhappy.
Hi, I'm just really curious. Obviously, 10 years ago, getting the private sector to actually take notice of climate change and all the associated problems would have been a lot harder than it is now. But what would you say the change has been in terms of like the biggest challenge in making people take notice of it then compared to talking to people in the private sector now? Have you seen a distinct change, or is it the same kind of battles that you feel like you're facing, like public, academia, private, that kind of?
Sorry,
does that make sense? Sorry.
No. Paraphrase.
I'll rephrase.
Yeah.
Now versus, say, 10 years ago, in
Yeah.
getting people to engage and collaborate across academic, public, and private spaces, in terms of the barriers that you face in terms of getting people to take note of what's going on and how holistic everything is, has there been much of a change in what the challenges and the barriers are to getting people to take action, or is it pretty similar to what it was, or what are they?
I think, you know, I used to be the head of public health workforce for England, and I had the freedom to choose to define what the public health workforce should be. And my definition was public health is everybody's responsibility and everybody's business. So I made it a point of going and speaking to built environment professionals, for example, and faculties of the built built environment, so faculties of architecture and engineering. To begin with, and we're going back 15 years now, to begin with there was a little bit of confusion as to, why are we working with, well, why are you, a public health physician, asking us to work with you? But it very quickly became evident as to why that we needed to work together, because urban planning has a direct impact on our health and on climate change. And the health core benefits of healthy urban planning are very, very evident. And this evidence was emerging in about 2000 and being written about in many journals and so on. So now it's become quite routine that many, many faculties of the built environment and urban planning and spatial planning will include modules and sensitize their students to the health impacts of urban planning. And that sort of thing has become normalized. It was not normal at that time. It was not routinized at that time. And so, those sorts of things have happened. So great things have happened, but not at the pace at which they should have happened, which is why we now have the IPCC report telling us that this has become so super urgent that we don't have time for, the occasional person like me who's very persistent and goes and talks to people and tries to persuade them to join us, but that we need to create these communities of action in a much quicker way. In fact, one of the things that I forgot to mention in one of the pictures I had, I sometimes wonder why we don't make better use of our, here we are, the green pharmacy. Now this is something I worked on with the pharmacy community and the chief pharmaceutical officer for England. And I said, well, pharmacy can really become a role model, a high street role model, by trying to cut back on its greenhouse gas emissions. How can we do that? And he was very amenable to working with me. So we started producing this. This went into some of their magazines and journals, so that Boots and everybody picked it up. And then there are GP surgeries where we could start working with GPs and say, well, could you, if you're working with someone who's overweight, why don't you point out to them that if they did something about their diet and restricting their diet and lowering their high blood pressure and so on, they'll be doing something good for their health as well as to the planet. So there are many things we could do, that still need further action, but which began a good 15 years ago. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I was really hoping it was going to be positive, so that's fine.
You were hoping that?
I was hoping it was going to be positive, and it was. So
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.